Hello, this video is designed to pick up where we left off. We previously have defined what multicultural education is, and now we want to look at how we go about implementing multicultural education in the school system. This change of bringing in multicultural curriculum into a school system or any type of school system change is often called reform or educational reform. So again, we're looking at different approaches to multicultural education curriculum. We've decided that the word curriculum means the content that is being taught. So how are we going to bring a multicultural perspective into the content that we're being taught in a new way, which is what the word reform means. So in our previous video, we defined what the multicultural education should look like, the dimensions it should include, and it's really one of the things that we strive for. We have some things in place now with the American public school system, but we're not quite where we need to be. There's always room for improvement. So let's talk about where we are now. Where we are now and where we've been in the past is really what is considered the mainstream-centric curriculum. And it's kind of the opposite of multicultural curriculum. It's a multicultural curriculum is considering all these different diversity subgroups, and mainstream-centric curriculum is more or less looking at one perspective, the most dominant perspective, and looking everything through those eyes. So again, multicultural curriculum is meant to include all these different diversities and subgroups and perspectives, while the mainstream-centric curriculum is really limited, and it focuses on it speaks about diversity, but it's only from one perspective. And that perspective happens to be that of European Americans. And you say, why? Well, if you look at it, for the majority of, especially since the foundation of America, who has been in charge the whole time? A lot of usually European American males. So that's where a lot of these perspectives have come from. Now, we've made some progress, as we've defined before. There's been some branching out to include other races and other gender perspectives, and a lot of that came forth during the civil rights and women's movements during the 1960s and 70s. However, we need a lot more multicultural elements to be put into place. And the reason why some of this is still, so where are we in this in our mainstream-centric curriculum is we still are looking at mainly the American experience, which is what we talked about in our last video, and not so much the ethnic groups and other ethnic groups and countries. So while we do have different races, different genders, different of those elements represented, we're still lacking a lot when it branches out of what we consider to be quote-unquote American macro culture. So why is this mainstream focus not working for us, and why is it detrimental to students? Number one, it ignores a lot of diverse subgroups. So we're leaving out a lot of different races, ethnics, language, religion, and cultures that don't fit into our quote-unquote American way. And so when we don't teach about these, it may later give way to racism, sexism, due to just our ignorance. So because we don't teach our students about different races, different cultures, different religions, they develop their own perspectives and viewpoints based upon facts, and then again it leads way to a lot of potential prejudice and discrimination. It is also bad for those who are benefiting from the mainstream-centric curriculum. So say that you are someone who the current curriculum is based on, and it's from your perspective and from your heritage. It's still bad for you because it can potentially give those students the idea of superiority, or that their history and their belief system is the most important or the most correct because it's the one that's written in the history books. So again, we don't want to give them that perspective either, so it can also harm them. It also denies these subgroups that are not represented the idea of social equality. A social equality is giving those in a school system the ability to feel like they're part of the school system, they're included, and who they are and all their diversity subgroups are acknowledged, appreciated, and supported. And again, if we don't educate based upon these different subgroups in a multicultural curriculum, it may often lead people feeling like that. So you may say, okay, well, it's simple. Just change from that perspective to a multicultural curriculum. I see where you're going with this. I see why it's important. Let's just flip the switch and change. It's not that easy. usually educational reforms are not that easy. One problem is an ideological resistant, and again, we're talking about this quote unquote American way. So in the past, and again, a perfect example is of the Native American culture into our own. We have a tendency to, we've defined what is American culture, and we kind of reject what doesn't fit into it. So taking into account the Native American culture. So when we were trying to assimilate the Native Americans into our own culture, we asked them to give up a lot of their own traditions, their language, a lot of their diversity subgroups to be more like us, which were the white Europeans at that point. So we can't just give up and say, we'll just go to multicultural education. It sounds like a good way to go, because really it's going to question our American way and our American culture, and that's going to be more difficult than we probably expected. Also, there are some political reasons, because knowledge is power. And when you give people power at the hands of, right now the power is at the hands of the mainstreamers. If you give too much power to these different subgroups, then again, you're really questioning the status quo, which makes it pretty uncomfortable. Now, most multiculturalists think that we should have kind of a balance, that we need to include this Western European culture that does have a legitimate basis in the American culture, but we also need to make sure that we include the contributions of other cultures and diversity subgroups. So they kind of want a happy medium. So the question is, how do we move to this? How do we go about moving to this multicultural curriculum that includes a lot of different perspectives and a lot of different experiences from a lot of different diversity subgroups? How do we make this happen? And there are four ways that we're making this happen, and they call those levels of integration of multicultural content, which is a fancy way of saying how we're trying to integrate multiculturalism into our current curriculum and what we're teaching. And so these are the four levels. As you go down the levels, so level 1 is the least multicultural friendly. Level 4 is the most multicultural friendly. So we'll talk a little bit about each of these approaches. Level 1 is the contributions approach. I call it the celebrations approach, and it is the one that is least aligning with the true idea of multicultural education. The reason why is it's kind of superficial. It's easy to implement, so this is where a lot of schools are at this point, because it's very easy for a teacher to do, but again, it's very superficial. And so if you reflect back on your school experiences, you've probably experienced this. It's where we come up and say, I want you to pick a hero of a certain gender or race or social class. So pick an African American hero. Pick an African American female hero. Pick someone who is a poverty hero, somebody who grew up in poverty and is now, quote unquote, a hero. They became the president. They became the first African American to do X, Y, and Z. They became the first female to do X, Y, and Z. They became the first person from a Hispanic heritage to do X, Y, and Z. So we pick a hero and celebrate them. Or we pick a holiday and celebrate it. So this is very typical, right? In May, we celebrate Cinco de Mayo. All of a sudden, everybody's a huge Cinco de Mayo fan. Or in the month of February, all of a sudden, we celebrate Black History Month, and we focus all this time and energy on celebrating Black history, heritage, and culture. But again, it's very usually somewhat superficial, and we end up picking heroes like Martin Luther King, Rosa Parks, people like that, and celebrate them. So again, it's very limited, it's very cherry-picked, and oftentimes it can be very stereotyped, which can actually be detrimental to the idea of a true multicultural education. The problem here is we're not changing from our current mainstream-centric curriculum to multicultural curriculum here. We're just taking our regular mainstream-centric curriculum and adding in a couple of heroes here and there on certain days and times. So there's some problems with this. Number one, it usually focuses on the good of that hero and doesn't really give the whole story. So for example, if we were using Martin Luther King as our example, we focus Dr. King, we all acknowledge he was a leader in the civil rights movement, we all acknowledge that he did great things, end of story. We often don't hear about the struggles of him getting there or the pulse of what that culture was like and what it was like during the civil rights movements for the different subgroups, not only African Americans, but African American males, African American females, white males, white females. They were there too. What was that experience like for them? So while Dr. King did a lot of great things, there's a bigger picture of racism that often isn't included in the conversation. Also, it can be very demeaning to those that are included or being celebrated. For example, we often paint Rosa Parks as just an old lady who was tired that didn't want to get off the bus. That was not what she was about. She was truly making a stand. It wasn't that she just wasn't tired. Also, we turned Cinco de Mayo into a party. That is really demeaning to the culture. It's not just a party. Also, it often just gives us that one-shot look of celebrating that one person's accomplishments, but not the full context of the history surrounding it. Also, it only lets us see it through the eyes of the mainstream-centric curriculum. So it's really not changing anyone's viewpoint. Again, it's just highlighting something in addition to what we are already doing. So moving on from that, we have the second level, which is called the additive approach, which is a little bit better. It's not just celebrating certain heroes or certain holidays, but it still has problems. So the additive approach is different because we're actually taking multicultural concepts, ideas, and perspectives, but it's really not changing the main structure that we currently have in the mainstream-centric curriculum. So we're really not changing anything. We're just adding in a little bit of perspective. So it's a little bit more in depth than the contribution or the celebration approach. So a classic example of this is in a mainstream-centric curriculum, we're learning about we're learning about the civil rights movement. So we're still learning about it from the viewpoint of the European American viewpoint. However, we're going to read a book written by somebody in a different diverse subgroup. So we're going to read a book by Dr. Martin Luther King, and we're going to include it in our historical lesson written from the mainstream perspective. So we just kind of added in something to make it a little bit diverse, but we really didn't change the foundation of what we were doing. So there are some problems with this. Number one, most of the story is still being told from the mainstream group, so we're not changing the overall structure. 90% of the lesson is still from that mainstream perspective, very, very limited perspective, while we just got a dash of an idea from another culture, from a supplementary resource. So we're not getting a full multicultural, multi-perspective. We're still just getting that one main one. Also, oftentimes it isn't heard from the subgroup's voice. So sometimes some of these things aren't even written by the author of that different subgroup, leaving you giving even more of a slanted viewpoint. So with level 3 is where we really start to make some change, and that's with the transformation approach. That's when we're really moving out of the current curriculum and really moving into the multicultural elements. And that's when our goals, our structures, and our perspectives really start to change, and we really start to focus on multiple viewpoints of everything, looking at the different perspectives. And so here's a graphic of maybe we're teaching music, history, art, literature, include whatever topic you want to teach there. In a transformational approach, we're looking at all these different races, all these different genders, all these different language, all these different ethnic backgrounds, and saying this is how they make up music. It's not the reverse. Notice that the arrows are going in. It's not that music is made up of all these different races, all these different genders, all these different languages. It's saying that all of these contribute to music, all of these contribute to history, and giving us all those different perspectives. Moving on for the transformation approach is the last one, which is the social action approach. And this is the most highly decorated form of multiculturalism and the multicultural curriculum. And so it's taken the transformational approach and adding in a real world element of asking the students to make decisions and take action. So we've learned about these different perspectives in the transformational approach, but now we're actually using them. So it adds in the aspects of social criticism, social change, and decision making. So actually asking them to do something with it. So some examples of what a lesson may look like. So a student would be given a problem or a question. Usually it relates to like social injustice or some type of change that needs to be made related to a diversity subgroup. They're given data, information, or background to give them the context of this problem of what's happening. Then they're asked to analyze it. They're asked to look at the situation, look at it from the different perspectives, put themselves in the shoes of these different subgroups, and then they're asked to make a decision or take action, deciding what to do. So was discrimination happening? Was prejudice happening? How do we deal with this clash of these two different diversity subgroups involving other people, or again, like we discussed prior, a clash among oneself? So again, that's taken us back to 4 different levels of multicultural education, and where we are in these different approaches. And that gives us some idea as to where we are in terms of having a multicultural curriculum change or reform.